Question number 3. Catherine
Tēnā koe,
Delahunty.
Mr Speaker, tēnā koutou katoa. To the Prime Minister, does he believe his meeting with Hon Malcolm Turnbull resulted in positive human rights outcomes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, not specifically, because human rights were not specifically discussed during my meeting with Mr Turnbull. However, as the member is aware, we did have a lengthy, direct conversation about the deportation of New Zealanders and the holding of New Zealanders in Australian detention centres. I'm pleased Mr Turnbull pledged to put more resources to processing appeals in order to accelerate them. This will help clear the backlog of people in the pipeline for deportation. He also announced other steps to improve the situation for New Zealand.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Catherine Delahunty.
Did he specifically ask Malcolm Turnbull to bring New Zealand citizens being detained offshore back onto the mainland of Australia?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I raised the issue of detention centres and said that I didn't think it was appropriate that New Zealanders were sent there. What I got was an assurance from Mr Turnbull that they would be upping significantly the resources so that New Zealanders won't have to go to detention centres because they'll be dealt with more quickly. But as Mr Turnbull pointed out, they're all free to come home to New Zealand and have their applications dealt with here.
Supplementary. Did he specifically...
Order. I haven't yet called the member. Supplementary question. Order. Supplementary question, Catherine Delahunty.
Did he specifically seek an assurance from Malcolm Turnbull that no more New Zealand citizens will be sent to offshore detention centres should they choose to remain in Australia while awaiting their deportation appeal?
The Right Honourable Prime
Mr
Minister.
Speaker, I think that's the point. If they choose to wait there, they are free to do that. I can't make them come home. But what the law does say is they're quite free to come home to New Zealand and have their application processed here.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Mr Speaker, it was a straight question asking, did he specifically seek an assurance?
Can I just ask the member to look at Speaker's Rulings 1874?
Love to.
And it will inform the member you cannot specifically demand a yes or no answer, which is clearly what the member wanted. The question was addressed. Supplementary question, Catherine Delahunty.
Did he specifically seek an assurance from Malcolm Turnbull that New Zealand citizens who would have been entitled to legal aid in Australia will continue to get access to that legal aid if they choose to come back to New Zealand while awaiting their deportation appeal?
The Right Honourable
Speaker,
Prime Minister.
there was no discussion about legal aid.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Catherine Delahunty.
Does he support Australia's bid for a seat on the United Nations Human Rights Council?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
That's very wide.
Mr Speaker, you need to direct that question to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Order.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Catherine Delahunty.
Why, as Prime Minister, will he not rule out supporting Australia's bid to the UN Human Rights Council, given that they have been cited for 143 violations by the very body they are seeking election to?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, in the first instance, that's a matter of for the Minister of Foreign Affairs to provide advice to me and the Cabinet.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Catherine Delahunty.
Does he believe Australia's treatment of detainees, New Zealanders and others, and the forced deportations that split families up should preclude it from a seat on the United Nations Human Rights Council?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, all I can say, and it's not my job to speak for Malcolm Turnbull, is that the Australians do not believe that there are human rights abuses taking place in their detention centres, and if there are any that New Zealanders feel...
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Point of order.
Order. No, the Prime Minister, any member has a right to raise a point of order. Point of order,
Mr.
Catherine
Speaker,
Delahunty.
he's not answering the question. I didn't ask what
Order.
Malcolm Turnbull said.
Order.
I asked what he's prepared to do.
Order. I'm trying to listen to the answer that the Prime Minister's given. If at the end of the answer the member feels it hasn't been addressed, the question can be raised with me, I'll then make a judgment. Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Exactly my point. So, Mr Speaker, it's not for me to speak to for the Prime Minister of Australia, but I can tell you that the position of the Australian government is that there are not human rights issues taking place in their detention centres. But as I've said publicly and in this House before, if New Zealanders feel they have any concerns, they're free to take those up with the Foreign Affairs consular staff, and we will have them investigated.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Catherine.
It was a
Delahunty.
specific question. Does he believe Australia's treatment of detainees? Not what does he think Malcolm Turnbull thinks?
Order. On this occasion, I will invite the member to repeat the question.
Thank you, Mr.
But can I just ask then that the member does not interrupt the answer, because it was very hard for me to then judge whether the answer does address the question. We'll have the supplementary question again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary. Does he believe Australia's treatment of detainees, New Zealanders and others, and the forced deportations that split families up should preclude it from a seat on the United Nations Human Rights Council?
That's a different question.
Order, I don't think it's not order. The Honourable Jerry Brownlee, the question's in order. I don't think it's substantially different. I invite the Prime Minister to answer it.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not in a position to judge the treatment of the Australian government in relation to other people detained on deportations. When it comes to New Zealanders, the position's quite clear. If a New Zealander feels there's a breach, they should raise that with Foreign Affairs.
Question number... Order. Order. Point of order, Chris Hopkins.
Mr. Speaker, I wanted to wait until the end of that question exchange because I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the questioning. But the point that I want to raise with you is in ruling on one of the points of order from Catherine Delahunty, you indicated that you were waiting until the end of the Prime Minister's answer to see whether he addressed the question. And the point that I wanted you to perhaps give some further consideration to is that ministers do need in their answers to confine themselves to the matter that they are being questioned on. And the implication of the ruling you made is that the ministers can stand up and say what they like, and providing at some point they eventually get to answering the question, that gives them carte blanche to say whatever they like. And there should be a principle that they at least have to restrict themselves to the subject area that they are being questioned on.
No, I don't need assistance from either on this occasion. I've got to judge it in relationship to the question that's asked. And when I consider this question is, does the Prime Minister believe the Australian treatment of detainees, etc., it's a question actually whether there's a responsibility for the Prime Minister in that regard in the first place. I then required some time to listen to the answer because I don't expect it's an easy one for the Prime Minister to answer when he's commenting on another country's treatment of detainees. So the judgment I will make will depend very much on the question that's asked. I appreciate the members raising a point genuinely, but I need to judge the length of an answer according to the complexity of the question. I guess that's the way I should put it. Question number 4, Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr.